welcome back to more FPL content. This will be the best wildcard squad for Gameweek 13. I already posted the best free hit team, so be sure to check that out, and you will see both of them compared in my team selection because I've got both chips available and I'm weighing between those two to activate in Gameweek 13. You can see the clean sheet odds on screen. Leeds United are bottom with a 10% chance of keeping a clean sheet against Man City. And for reference, by the way, in UCL Fantasy, Bayer Leverkusen were bottom of all Champions League teams with a 7% chance against Man City away. But after the 10 changes Pep Guardiola made, Leverkusen were able to secure a 2-0 victory in matchday 5. As for the top 6 though, Man City are at the number 1 spot with a 54% chance of keeping a clean sheet against Leeds United. Aston Villa are second, facing Wolves in that local derby. Brentford are third, with Liverpool, Tottenham and Newcastle completing the top 6. It's very rare to see a top 6 clean sheet list without Arsenal, who are facing Chelsea away. That will be a clash at the top of the Premier League table. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Drop a like on this video, subscribe to my channel, and also hit that notification bell so you're always up to date on my content for both FPL and UCL Fantasy, which I'll cover until the end of the season. Let's get this video in particular to over 150 likes and closing on new goals like 38k on YouTube. Check all the links in the description for my Patreon and the championships. Fair likes to my videos, proud to add to comments amongst many other perks. My Discord server, the FPL League and Spotify can also be found in the description. Keep your eyes peeled, of course, for the team selection podcast. And if you want to see a predicted lineups video as well, then let me know down in the comment section and also show your support through all the different means that I just mentioned. But without further ado, let's jump straight into it. At the time of recording, my squad value is 101.3 million overall when you also count the money I've got in the bank. But in terms of spending power, it is approximately 100 million on the dot. But I do have value tied up in certain players, which makes it easier for me to get them in. That might not be the case for everybody watching, and others will have even more money at a disposal. But I'll start off with the 2 goalkeepers, and I think with the backup, that becomes quite clear. You don't need to have 2 rotating options like Verbruggen and Kelleher, who actually have some decent fixtures, and Brentford and Brighton do combine very well. You could go for that sort of goalkeeper rotation, but I'm going to go for more of a traditional one where you've got a standout who's going to start week in, week out, with the odd exception, and a 4 million backup who should do the job. I'll get the obvious out of the way with Martin Dubravka, who has featured in virtually every single wildcard video so far this season. At 4 million, he's the only starting goalkeeper in the Premier League. We had Darlow for a couple of weeks until Perry returned from injury, so I think Dubravka makes a lot of sense. If you are really keen on having a rotating goalkeeper pair, you might want to consider the likes of Petrovic, Kelleher and Verbruggen, and I think the last 2 would combine very well if you look at it purely based on the fixtures. But sometimes it doesn't go according to plan and you could have some bench points and also team selection headaches, and I think having a set and forget option like David Raya is probably the way to go. But it might surprise you here because I'm opting for Robert Sanchez despite Chelsea having some poor fixtures on paper, and he's not even in the top 5 for points scored. And for Gameweek 13, I would seriously consider starting Dubravka over Sanchez, but that wouldn't be the case with David Raya necessarily. I know Chelsea are in great form and they just beat Barcelona 3-0, but Arsenal still have such an imperious defence, and with Raya and any defender, you'd still be tempted to start them in most game weeks. And with Dubravka, I don't expect a clean sheet against Brentford away. So I do admit that this goalkeeper combination doesn't look great for Gameweek 13, but in the long term, you spend a minimal amount of money in this position and you should get plenty of clean sheets from Robert Sanchez, and in the odd occasion, you could also get a few points from Martin Dubravka from saves and the odd clean sheet here and there from Burnley. So I think this is a good goalkeeper combination. I started this season with Sanchez and Dubravka, and if I was wildcarding in Gameweek 13, I would go for something like this, but this can change on a weekly basis, and if you have enough money, David Raya would be the standout goalkeeper in FPL. There are multiple players who are on the brink of receiving a suspension because if you pick up 5 yellow cards within the first 19 matches of a Premier League season, you will be suspended for a match, and Daniel Munoz is currently on 4 yellow cards, so be very mindful about that. The last booking was obviously very weird to say the least, but it is in the rules. Unfortunately, if you take your shirt off, then you will get booked, despite the fact that he was sending a message after his goal against Wolves. But he is facing Man United next. I think Crystal Palace could concede in this game, but they have a fairly decent record against big teams recently, especially the likes of Liverpool, for example, and they have caused Man United problems over the years, particularly at Selhurst Park. So I think Daniel Munoz is an excellent choice. Even Dean Henderson in goal isn't too shabby, and any defender is going to be a solid pick. I think Mitchell is the worst of the lot, but he's still solid in the grand scheme of things. The likes of Mark Gay, Richards and Lacroix are all very close. I think it's between Gay and Munoz as the very best overall though. And this might also surprise you, but I'm opting for Virgil van Dijk as the premium defender of choice here. He costs 6 million, and despite conceding 3 times against Nottingham Forest at home, he's still got defensive contribution points, and I think he's going to be very consistent when it comes to DEFCON. But we need to see Liverpool keep more clean sheets. They've got excellent fixtures coming up, but Nottingham Forest was one of them on paper, and they failed miserably. They also lost 3-0 before the international break against Man City, and that's 8 defeats out of the last 11 matches across all competitions before the PSV Eindhoven game on Wednesday night. So let's see how they fare, but Van Dijk is still a good choice in the grand scheme of things, especially if Liverpool can find that balance and start tightening up defensively. But I'm also going to go for a 5 million option in Nico O'Reilly, who was benched in the Champions League against Bayer Leverkusen in a 2-0 defeat for Man City, and he's my favourite way of covering the citizens defensively. I think Gvardiol also offers good value. Ruben Dias is starting virtually every single game in the Premier League, and Donnarumma is a decent choice between the sticks, but I would just rather go for David Raya at 0.1, 0.2 million more. So Nico O'Reilly takes the cake here, and I think it's worth having a lot of money invested in this defensive line. You might also want to consider Marcus Senesi, who doesn't make the cut in this team, but I will show you alternatives towards the end of this podcast using the website FPL.team, but I would certainly recommend an Arsenal defender like Hincapié or Jurrien Timber, who costs 6.3 million now, and another way of finding enough money to go from Sanchez to David Raya is to downgrade Timber to Hincapié, and that could be enough to double up on the Gunners defensively, which is still viable in my opinion. But over the next 3 fixtures, there is Chelsea and Aston Villa away. That's not going to be easy for the Gunners, but Jurrien Timber is the best right back in the Premier League, and he's so consistent, and against Tottenham Hotspur he got 5 points. It could have been double that at the very least. And Arsenal also conceded a sloppy goal, and by the way, it's a fantastic finish by Richarlison. He did his bit, but in terms of how the goal was conceded, I think Arsenal recently have been a bit sloppier with some of the goals they've let in and the chances they're conceding. But Jurrien Timber remains the best defender in FPL. In the absence of Gabriel for the next month or two, you could certainly make a case for Daniel Munoz for that throne, but I think both of them should be in your wildcard squad. And to facilitate all these expensive defenders, I would go for a cheaper option here from Sunderland, and Mukiele is probably the best. He does have DEFCON potential. Ballard does cost 4.6 million if you can stretch to him. He does have more goal threat, and he is a DEFCON monster, but Mukiele is at 4.2 million. There is no guarantee that Alderete will start over Gertruida. And then you've got the Leeds players who have awful fixtures for the next 4 game weeks. And in terms of Burnley, Dubravka is enough to cover their defence. But if you need the extra money, Esteve at 3.9 million or Hartman at 4 offers a bit of assist threat. And of course, Esteve will give you more DEFCONs, but not as consistently as we would have thought going into pre-season and the start of this campaign. But Mukiele has been very solid for Sunderland since signing for them from Paris Saint-Germain. So I think this is a very good defensive line. You've got nice coverage with some of the top teams across the country. I think Liverpool will get back to a decent position in the league over time, but it might take a little while to get there, and Virgil van Dijk could be worth that 6 million price tag in the end. But I could certainly understand any reservations about going for the Dutch centre-back. And let's now move on to the midfielders, where things get even more interesting with plenty of options at our disposal. It's also a matter of a lack of standout midfielders, and over the years we could maybe really pinpoint the kind of best midfielders definitively. It's not really the case this season. It's so open-ended with DEFCON. Players like Caicedo are now entering the equation, and you've also got the goals being shared around. Some players are getting multiple assists, like Minter with 7 for the season, but only 1 goal. So I think it's difficult to really highlight the 5 midfielders who are definitively better than the rest. But Minter will be one of my favourite ones considering Brighton's fixtures, his form, and also the consistency when it comes to the assists. But there is a massive overperformance with the creativity, which I highlighted in my transfer tips, and you might want to cover Brighton's attack with Danny Welbeck up front. But I think Minter is still worth 6.1 million, and its ownership is relatively low at between 6 to 7% ownership overall. I'd also consider Morgan Rogers as a short-term punt. I particularly like him against Wolves at home, and he just scored a brace against Leeds United, and back in October, he was showing a bit of consistency over a 3-4 game week stretch, but we want to see that now over a prolonged period of time, and I think he's the best Aston Villa asset. You might also want to consider a Villa defender like Matty Cash or Emi Martinez in goal, but I think Aston Villa are more solid defensively against the best teams in the country. Look at their clean sheet against Man City a couple of weeks ago, then they conceded against Leeds, of course, in the opening minutes. They still went on to win that game, and it was all thanks to Morgan Rogers. I certainly wouldn't be going for Ollie Watkins. He has been awful this season. Buendia is a decent differential to consider at such a cheap price tag, and he's showing great form, but I think Morgan Rogers is still the go-to Aston Villa asset. I would go for Declan Rice too, but you've got Eze, and both of them are in the podium of the highest scoring midfielders in FPL, just behind Antoine Semenyo, and then you've got Minter in fourth, and Brian Mbeumo in fifth. So we're going to have plenty of those options in this squad. And despite that one-pointer against Everton, Brian Mbeumo still had moments, and he is still the Man United midfielder of choice over Bruno Fernandes, who was probably the standout United player in that 1-0 defeat against Everton. But Mbeumo offers more threat from open play, and with 5 free transfers in Game Week 16 because of AFCON, you can sell players like Mbeumo and Minter when they head off with their countries to the African Cup of Nations, so that could still work out very well. And in the case of Declan Rice, he's fixture-proof, he can score defensive contribution points, he is a brilliant set-piece taker, although against Tottenham I think the quality of the deliveries was a bit lacking, and from open play he can score an assist on the odd occasion, and he's an all-round midfielder. There is a reason why he has 71 points for the season, only 4 behind Semenyo, who had such a brilliant start. And whilst you might want to consider the Ghanaian, who will stay with Bournemouth over the African Cup of Nations period because Ghana didn't qualify for that competition, you could certainly go for Semenyo and even Kudus if you want to invest in that Tottenham attacker. I personally wouldn't recommend it, and instead I like one Newcastle midfielder, and it's not Harvey Barnes, who scored against Marseille and got a brace against Man City on top of a goal against Brentford, so he's showing incredible form. Anthony Gordon is back in the equation, and my favourite Newcastle midfielder is Bruno Guimaraes, who is a complete midfielder in the grand scheme of things. He can get DEFCON with 97 for the season, he can score and assist at a decent rate, just like Declan Rice, and he can get bonus points in the process. The underlying numbers are horrible though for the Brazilian, but I still think he's a solid midfielder in FPL terms, and because of how good he is overall, he can always find a way to get some points on a consistent basis. So these 5 midfielders might seem a bit surprising. You've got a few differentials in there, but I think there's a nice mix and you can rotate very well. Squad depth is very important over the Christmas period, and you might also want to consider a City attacker like Jeremy Doku or Phil Foden. They both look very appealing against Leeds this week, and Man City have some of the best fixtures over the next 5 game weeks. A Salah or Gakpo could also do very well in the short term, but Liverpool have been atrocious so far this season, and there are plenty more where that came from, like Eze and Semenyo, who I mentioned previously, maybe a Chelsea midfielder like Pedro Neto, Caicedo, or Enzo Fernandez, and even the likes of Ndai and Joao Paulinho are right up there for points scored amongst midfielders for a reason, and they've both been highlighted in my wildcard videos and the Transfits podcast. But let's now complete this 15-man squad with the 3 forwards before moving on to the starting 11 and the captaincy. Jean-Philippe Mateta was subbed off in the 59th minute, just a few seconds away from getting an appearance point, so only 1 point against Wolves, and he missed a huge opportunity. It just went wide in the first half, and he was very frustrating for those that owned him, particularly captainers for Game Week 12. But I don't think people will have that same opinion against Man United, as bad as the Red Devils have been over the past couple of years. And of course, they were awful against Everton, who were down to 10 men, by the way. But Crystal Palace have shown a lot of form on the other side and more consistency. And I think Palace would be the favourites in this matchup. And I wouldn't mind having 1 or 2 Palace assets, not just for Game Week 13, but also in the long term. Ismail Assar in the midfield could also be considered, but he has massively underperformed and he can be very frustrating as an FPL asset, just like Mateta was before that hat-trick against Bournemouth a couple of months ago. But I'm also going to go for Erling Haaland. He is the standout captaincy option against Leeds on paper, but he has been poor in the last couple of Premier League and Champions League games, with a goal against Liverpool, but he missed a penalty, so only 4 points. He blanked against Newcastle and also played 25 minutes against Bayer Leverkusen and didn't score or assist in that game. So I think Haaland doesn't have anything to prove, of course. His goal record is insane for club and country, and just look at his Premier League record, it speaks for itself. But against Leeds, I think a brace or hat-trick is possible, and if you got the triple captaincy chip, I think it's a great time to use it. But there's also Gameweek 17 when Man City hosts West Ham. That is still a great opportunity. And even Sunderland in Gameweek 15 doesn't look too shabby. But for the first half of the season, I would go for Erling Haaland as the triple captain in one of those 3 game weeks. And I think Gameweek 13 is the best of the lot. But it's also a great opportunity to use the free hit or wildcard, and that's where it comes down to prioritizing these boosters. Check out my chip strategy guide and all my FPL content to see the best course of action for your FPL squads. The last forward is Igor Thiago, who is second for points scored amongst forwards in Fantasy Premier League, only behind Erling Haaland with 64 FPL points, and he went up in price the other night to 6.5 million. I would expect another price change before the Gameweek 13 deadline on Saturday, where I'll be providing the ultimate FPL coverage with the top 10 captains, clean sheet odds, injury updates, team news, suspensions, you name it. So you're well prepared for Gameweek 13 and beyond. But Igor Thiago will be one of the main candidates to rival Erling Haaland for the captaincy this week, facing Burnley at home. But I still think the Norwegian is a step above. If you were to go for Dubravka and Robert Sanchez on the wildcard, I would pick Dubravka to start against Brentford away as opposed to Robert Sanchez against Arsenal at home. But that is certainly subjective and you might have a different opinion on that. With Munoz, Van Dijk and O'Reilly in that defensive line, Minter, Rodgers, Bruno Guimaraes and Mbeumo in the midfield, with Mateta, Haaland and Thiago up front. And there are some great players on the bench like Rice and Timber, and Mukiele would complete the 50-man squad. But you could also go for something like this to facilitate Eze over Declan Rice, and that would probably mean downgrading Van Dijk to a 5 million defender or under, like Senesi, for example, and having that Bournemouth defensive coverage. But it doesn't stop there. There are other changes you could make. You might not want that Chelsea coverage at all, and you want to have a better goalkeeper for Gameweek 13 and beyond, arguably. But I still think Chelsea will keep more clean sheets than Brighton, Brentford, and Bournemouth overall. But you could consider something like this and then go for Petrovic, for example. And I talked about the goalkeeper pairing of Kelleher and Verbruggen. That could also work for a lot of people. And if we look at the other things we could change as well a little bit, that could also mean Eze to Ismaila Sarr. And I talked about this earlier in this podcast. I would go for Jurrien Timber regardless, but something else you might want to consider is Timber to Hincapié, and that gives you enough money to go from Petrovic to David Raya. So I'm just showing you all these different things you could do on the wildcard and using free transfers to get the money needed to have your ideal 15-man squad. I'd still go for Nico O'Reilly, but he's not an absolute must-have, and I think there are other options in that City defence like Gvardiol or Donnarumma between the sticks, but I wouldn't go for the Italian over David Raya. Instead of Munoz, if you are struggling for funds, you might want to consider Gay or Richards, who went up in price to 4.6 million on Tuesday. And instead of Minter, for example, you might want to go for Xhaka and have a cheaper midfielder as your 5th option, essentially. And even Bruno Guimaraes isn't an absolute nailed-on player in this team. The same goes for Rodgers, and Saka is still a viable option to cover Arsenal offensively over Declan Rice and Eze. In terms of other forwards you might want to consider, I like Haaland, Thiago and Mateta the most, but there are 2 others that would stand out. One of them is Nick Voltemada, who you might want to go for to cover Newcastle offensively, but I wouldn't go for him and Harvey Barnes or Bruno Guimaraes simultaneously. And the other one, who's even more likely, and in the power rankings, he would rank higher than Voltemada, that's going to be Danny Welbeck at 6.6 million. So having this sort of structure with Welbeck and Thiago with Erling Haaland gives you a lot of money in the bank. But of course, I've also made other changes and shown you other alternatives in every single position, and I wouldn't necessarily go for this as the final wildcard squad. And you can use this money to then go to Cole Palmer, who could be back very soon because he was in training ahead of that game against Barcelona, and a return against Arsenal isn't out of the question. So then you've only got 0.3 million in the bank, but you've still got plenty of squad depth. And if you're still struggling for funds, I mentioned this before, Mukiele to Esteve or Hartman could also be on the cards. But ideally, I wouldn't have Dubravka and a Burnley defender because you might need this option from time to time during the Christmas period with injuries, suspensions, rotation and other factors that will play a massive part throughout December, and a lot of teams have a congested fixture schedule. Thank you very much for watching this video, Analyst Says Podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it insightful, then like this podcast, subscribe to my channel, and also hit that notification bell so you're always up to date on my content, both FPL and UCL Fantasy. Let's get this video to over 150 likes and closing on new goals like 38k on YouTube. Follow me on X, Instagram and Blue Sky, Dylan RCM, and check all the links in the description for my Patreon and the Champships. further access to my videos, proud to comments, amongst many other perks. My Discord server, the FPL League and Spotify can also be found in the description. I'll see you on Saturday for the next deadline stream. There could also be a reaction on the same day, and there's going to be a very quick turnaround for the Gameweek 14 deadline next Tuesday.